Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to your friends to CEC live lectures. Friends, as you know that we started a series on microeconomics and today we are conducting yet another lecture in the same series. In today's lecture we will talk about demand analysis. It is in continuation with the previous lecture on demand analysis. To discuss this topic we have with us a subject expert Dr. Bharat Singh. Dr. Singh is Associate Professor, Department of Economics at Satyavati Evening College, University of Delhi. Without further ado, I would like to welcome sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, madam, and viewers and the students of this program. In fact, the demand analysis is a very important topic of the microeconomics, and as you are aware that in the previous lecture that was delivered on 4th of this month, we had spoken a lot about the demand analysis. Now, in continuation to that topic, today I am going to discuss some other important aspects related to this important topic of microeconomics. As we know that the general law of demand states that the price of a commodity and its quantity demanded are inversely related, ceteris paribus. By now, most of you or probably all of you might have been aware of the assumptions of the ceteris paribus. When we speak about the relationship between price and quantity demanded of a commodity, we presume it's an assumption of important assumption of microeconomics that other things remain same, they are not allowed to change, or for the time being they are kept constant. Say for example, prices of the other commodities, it's a substitute goods, and the price of the complementary goods, the income of the consumer, then taste, fashion, preferences of the consumer, and other important variables. Because if side by side, if along with the price of the commodity itself, the other factors are allowed to change, it will not be able to demonstrate the actual impact of the change in price of the commodity itself on its quantity demanded. Therefore, it's a practice, a standard practice in the microeconomic theory, and particularly the law of demand analysis, that along with this law of demand, we keep assumption of constancy of certain important variables which may otherwise be affecting the quantity demanded of a commodity along with change in its price. So, for simplicity, we can say that other things remaining constant, there exists an inverse relationship between the price of a commodity and its quantity demanded. And this relationship between the price of the commodity and its quantity demanded can be shown, can be demonstrated with this this equation or demand function, that dx is a function of px, where dx refers to quantity demanded of commodity x, for example, and px is the price of commodity x. The left hand side of the equation, dx, this variable is treated as dependent variable, while the right hand variable of this equation, px, is treated as independent variable. This is mainly because of the fact there is a relation of dependency between these two variables, wherein the quantity demanded of commodity x is supposed to be dependent on, supposed to be influenced by the price of the commodity itself, say price of x in the present case. Although dx has been shown to be a function of px, and there is a positive sign before the symbol f. However, it should not be construed as having a positive relationship. In fact, these two variables are negative relationship, and unless and until these two variables have a negative relationship or inverse relationship, the change in price of the commodity will not produce an opposite change in the quantity demanded of the commodity. This fact should be kept in mind, that dx is negatively related to the price of the commodity or inversely related. After having understood this law of demand in its functional form or in form of this equation, the demand function, this demand function does not show the quantity, actual quantity of change in demand due to change in the price of the commodity. If we are interested to know the actual quantity or quantitative changes in the quantity demanded of a commodity, the amount of the demand as a result of change in its price, this quantitative relationship can be shown with the help of a mathematical example, wherein dx is equal to a minus b within bracket px, where a is constant. A is constant in the sense that this is the minimum quantity of demand even if price is 0. So, and b is the slope of the this demand function, and this is equal to delta d upon delta p. The slope has been demonstrated as it has been shown as delta d upon delta p, which means that a small change in price of the commodity results into how much change in quantity demanded, that is shown with the help of this slope of the demand curve, that is delta d upon delta p. Given a constant demand, even if the price of the commodity is 0, the higher the price, the lower will be the demand, and the lower the price, the higher is the demand. And this mathematical equation of the demand function is in fact demonstrates the inverse relationship between the price of the commodity and its quantity demanded, which we saw that in earlier equation dx is a function of px was not there. Now, question arises. We have already spoken a lot about the law of demand in our previous lecture. The question arises as to how, why does the law of demand operate at all, or why does the demand curve slope downward to the right? There are in fact two kinds of explanations or two kinds of the theory explaining the reason behind downward slope of the demand curve. One is the Marshallian utility theory. It is also known as the theory of marginal utility, and this Marshallian utility theory is a very logical explanation of the consumer behavior, that as a consumer consumes larger and larger quantity of a commodity, the marginal utility derived from the consumption of that commodity has a tendency to decline. So, here again there exists an inverse relationship between the price, the quantity of a commodity consumed and the subsequent utility or the additional utility that the consumer derives by consuming different units of that commodity. In fact, in order to understand how the Marshallian utility theory explains the law of operation of the law of demand, or how does it explain the downward slope of the demand curve, it is better to have some concept of the total utility and marginal utility. The total utility derived by a consumer is the sum total of the utility derived by consuming different units of a commodity during a given period of time. The marginal utility shows in fact the change in total utility as a result of consuming an additional unit of that commodity. Symbolically, if u is a function of qx, then mux would be expressed as delta u upon delta qx. In other words, u is supposed to be influenced by the quantity, total quantity of the commodity X consumed. It is a function of the total quantity of a commodity consumed. Then marginal utility can be shown to be a ratio of total utility, change in total utility and change in quantity demanded or quantity consumed of commodity X. It has been explained here also in this slide, present slide, that U refers to total utility, while Q refers to total quantity of good X consumed. MUX is equal to marginal utility of X, delta U is equal to change in total utility, and delta QX refers to change in total quantity of good X consumed. The MU theory or marginal utility theory explains the behavior of the demand curve or the operation of the law of demand via explaining an important law, that is law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility was propounded by the great neoclassical economist Alfred Marshall, which states, this law states a negative relationship between quantity of a commodity consumed and the marginal utility derived by a consumer from it. That is the commodity. In other words, a consumer consumes, as a consumer consumes larger and larger quantity of a commodity, the subsequent utility derived from the commodity, that is marginal utility, goes on diminishing ceteris paribus. Here again we are taking the assumption of ceteris paribus, because unless and until we keep some assumption, this law would fail to operate. So, this law is operational, this law is valid only under certain assumptions, which we would discuss in our future course of lecture. We always know that a rational consumer always tries to equalize Px and Mux. We are at this moment not able to explain the exact reasons for the operation of the law of demand or downward slope of the demand curve, mainly because of the fact, in order to understand clearly the factors responsible for the operation of the law of demand, it is very important to know and understand some important concepts and their interrelationship in order to proceed further. That is why I have chosen to explain you the important concepts like total utility, marginal utility, law of diminishing marginal utility, their interrelationships, and how does a rational consumer behave in the market, because all these variables, all these factors are going to ultimately explain the reasons for the downward slope of the demand curve. So, I was just trying to state before you that how does a rational consumer behave. A rational consumer is that consumer which is always conscious, who is always aware to maximize his benefit or maximize his utility. Now, given the prices of different commodities and marginal utilities derived from those commodities, how does a consumer would behave in the market so that his benefit or total utility is maximized. In a particular case, particular example, say for example commodity X, how a consumer would behave in a given price marginal utility situation so that his benefit or his total utility is maximized. No rational consumer would like to behave in such a manner that his total utility is less than optimum. In the present case, a rational consumer would be able to maximize his total utility only under the situation of equality of price of X and the marginal utility of X. Or in other words, we can say that a rational consumer will always try to equalize the price of the commodity on the one hand and marginal utility of on the other. no rational consumer would like to pay a price for a good which is higher than utility derived by consuming this commodity. It is an effort, it is an endeavor by each and every rational consumer to pay the price of the commodity only to that extent which equalizes his marginal utility. In this attempt, the consumer is willing to pay the price of a good which is equal to its marginal utility. Symbolically, we can say that the consumer would maximize his utility only under the situation when MUX is equal to PX under the present example. What will happen if MUX is greater than PX? If MUX is greater than PX, then it would be beneficial for the consumer to consume more and more additional unit of the commodity, and he will or she will continue to consume that commodity till such point it becomes equal to price of the commodity. How this equality can be established? If MUX is greater than PX, and in a bid to increase its total utility, the consumer consumes more and more units of that commodity, say X. In this process, its marginal utility or marginal utility of good X would decline, price of X remaining constant. Or if the consumer increases consumption of X, its marginal utility would decline on the one hand, and as a result of increase in quantity demanded of X, the price of X would also start increasing gradually. This dynamism, this fluctuation in MUX and PX would continue till such point where MUX becomes equal to PX. Take another situation in which MUX is less than PX, or marginal utility of commodity X is lower than price charged by the seller. What will happen then? In this situation, the consumer would be at loss, or his total utility will be less than the equilibrium point, less than the optimum point. In order to maximize his utility, the consumer would reduce consumption of commodity by some amount. If consumer reduces the consumption of X, its marginal utility will increase, and as a reduction in the consumption or demand for commodity X, the prices of X would also start declining. This fluctuation in the prices and the marginal utility would again continue till such point where MUX is PX. So, a rational consumer would always attempt to establish an equality between MUX and PX, and by for establishing this equality, the consumer reshuffles his consumption of different commodities. He goes on changing the quantities of one commodity or more than one commodity. The whole explanation of the relationship between MUX and PX can also be explained with the help of this diagram. This diagram, the horizontal axis, that is OX axis, and horizontal the vertical axis is OY axis. The OX axis represents different units of commodity X, that is QX, and OY axis represents the marginal utility of X from different units and the price of X also. We see in this diagram that marginal utility curve for commodity X has a downward slope. It has a negative slope. So, what does it show? It shows that as a consumer consumes more and more units of the commodity, its marginal utility goes on declining. Or inversely, if the consumption of commodity X is reduced, its marginal utility increases. The above diagram and the equation in the previous slide also show the interrelationship between law of diminishing, marginal utility and the law of demand. The law of demand we have already seen also also explains an inverse relationship between the price of the commodity and its quantity demanded on the one hand, and on the other hand the marginal utility and quantity consumed of a commodity has also a negative relationship, and both the curves, that is the marginal utility curve and the demand curve, slope downward to the right. So, it is a significant similarity between the two curves via the similarity between the behavior of the two variables separately. On the one hand, we have variables like price of the commodity and its quantity demanded, and in another case we have two variables like quantity consumed of the commodity and marginal utility derived out of this consumption. So, there is great similarity between the two concepts, two sets of the variables so far as their behavior is concerned. So, by looking at the behavior of these two variables separately, in fact marginal utility can be transformed into or can be subsumed in the demand curve by the above arguments. In other words, if we replace MUX curve with PX on the y axis, the MU curve will become the demand curve. Here in this diagram, if we allow QX to remain on x axis and on y axis we replace MUX with price of x and the curve this MUX with the demand curve, then this relationship will change altogether from relationship between MU curve and corresponding QX to the price of x and its quantity demanded. Now, this relationship between total utility and marginal utility functions can also be explained mathematically if some of the students have a little bit knowledge of the calculus or derivative. They can very easily understand in a precise manner the TU and MU functions in mathematical manner. We start by, let the utility function be U is equal to U is a function of QX as we have seen in the previous slides, where utility U is measured in monetary units. If the consumer buys QX quantity of good X, his expenditure on QX would be QX into PX. The number of quantity consumed or purchased multiplied by the price of the commodity X. So, total expenditure will be like this. If the consumer seeks to maximize his benefit or utility, he can do it by maximizing the difference between his utility and his expenditure. The necessary condition mathematically as per the rules of the differentiation, the necessary condition for a maximum or for maximizing this function is that the partial derivative of the utility function with respect to QS should be equal to 0. Thus, in this example, delta U upon delta QX minus delta within bracket Px into Qx, the product of price of x and quantity demanded for x divided by delta Qx should be equal to 0. This is the first condition for maxima or minima both. Now, rearranging this equation, we can express this equation as follows, that delta U upon delta Qx is equal to delta Px into delta Qx again within bracket divided by delta Qx, or delta U upon delta Qx is equal to Px. And we have already seen that delta U upon delta Qx is nothing but the marginal utility, because this shows the change in total utility as a result of change in quantity demanded or quantity consumed of commodity X. Therefore, by solving this equation, it is clear that a consumer is in equilibrium or consumer maximizes his utility as per the earlier conditions, necessary condition, only when mu x is equal to p x. And I have already explained that why the equality of mu x and p x is necessary for maximizing the utility of the consumer. What will happen if mu x is greater than p x, or what would happen if mu x is less than p x. So, this is the we can say that traditional theory or neoclassical theory propounded by Alfred Marshall to explain why the law of demand operates at all, or why does the demand curve slope downward to the right. Now, we have explanation 2. This is called the modern theory of demand, and modern theory of demand is centered around the concept of price effect, income effect, and substitution effect. It has attempted to explore the factors behind operation of the law of demand, or behind the rightward slope of the demand curve in somewhat different manner, although it is asserted by some of the economists that law of diminishing marginal utility or utility theory is inherent in this theory also. So far as price effect is concerned, it shows the impact of change in quantity demanded of a commodity due to change in its price. So, price effect is simply the relationship between price of a commodity and its quantity demanded. Say for example, if the price of a commodity falls from rupees 20 to rupees 10 and quantity demanded of a commodity increases from 50 units to 80 units. So, here price effect would be equal to 30. So, it is simply the explanation of the law of demand in different manner, wherein the impact of change in price of a commodity is studied on the quantity demanded of the commodity. What does the price effect consist within itself? It is an altogether different kind of you can say the exploration by the modern economist, that price effect is not a simple entity. It contains within itself two distinct kind of the effects, and it has been termed as income effect and the substitution effect. Income effect shows the change in quantity demanded of a commodity due to change in real income or purchasing power of the consumer. If the price of the commodity falls in the market, some money is saved by the consumer, resulting in increase of his real income. It is a matter of imagination. If you put in a little bit of your mind to think about a situation, say for example, a consumer consumes 20 units of a commodity at a price of rupees 10, say for example, and if the price of the commodity falls from 10 to 5 and the consumption of the commodity increases from 20 to 30, this increase in demand for the commodity by 10 units, it appears that it is a price effect. But this price effect contains within itself the income effect as well as substitution effect. How income effect is inherent in price effect? It is a matter to think. When price of the commodity falls, just think about it, when price of the commodity falls, and if the consumer does not increase the demand, say for example, what will happen? The consumer will save some amount of money with him, and this saving will result into increase in the purchasing power of the consumer. In the language of economics, this increase in purchasing power of the consumer is known as increase in real income of the consumer. So, money income remaining the same, the change in price of the commodity has resulted into changes in purchasing power of the consumer. In other words, the real income of the consumer has changed. If the price falls, price of the commodity falls, the real income of the consumer will increase, and if the price of the commodity increases, the real income of the consumer will decline. So, it is a normal behavior of the consumer that if the real income of the consumer increases as a result of fall in price of the commodity, he has a tendency to increase the quantity demanded of that commodity by some amount. It happens for in case of a normal commodity. On the other hand, if the price of the commodity increases in the market, the consumer is at a loss in the real terms, in the real income terms, and therefore, it will reduce the demand because of his because of the decline in his real income. And I will continue with the next part of the lecture in just after a few minutes. Thank you very much. Welcome back, viewers and students of this program. So, I was just explaining the income effect, and I was trying to explain you as to how the income effect has entered into the price effect, and how income effect has a very important role in changing the volume of demand as a result of change in price, and what will happen if as a result of change in the price of the commodity there is change in the real income of the consumer, and what impact will it have on the quantity demanded of that commodity. And I told you that just now that when the real income of the consumer increases, the quantity demanded of that commodity will also increase, and vice versa. Next component of the price effect besides income effect is the substitution effect. And we have seen that price effect consists of the income effect on the one hand and substitution effect on the other. And income effect is the change in quantity demanded of a commodity when the real income of the consumer changes, other things remaining the same. Similarly, so far as substitution effect is concerned, when the price of a commodity, say Px, remains constant and that of its substitute good, say Py, increases, Px become relatively cheaper. It is a very common sense matter that if the price of one commodity does not change and price of its substitute good increases, then the earlier commodity, that is commodity X, will seem to be cheaper as compared to the price of commodity Y, and vice versa. That is, in other words, we can say that if the price of commodity Y remains the same and price of commodity X increases, then commodity X become costlier, relatively costlier as compared to price of Y, or we can say that the price of Y, the commodity Y has become relatively cheaper as compared to its substitute goods, say commodity X. So, any increase in QX due to increase in PY is known as substitution effect, and vice versa. In other words, if the price of Y increases and due to this, if the quantity demanded of commodity X increases, then it is a substitution effect. We can take this example in another way also. Say for example, price of X declines, price of X declines, price of Y does not change, and commodity Y remaining, the commodity Y being substitute of commodity X. So, QY does not change and QX declines. As a result of decline in price of X, the income effect is generated. Real income increases, we have already seen it. Side by side, since this commodity has become cheaper as compared to commodity Y, or in other words, we can say that relative price of commodity X has fallen. It has become relatively cheaper. What will happen? What kind of behavior we can observe on the part of the consumer? The consumer will increase quantity demanded of commodity X also because of commodity X being relatively cheaper as compared to commodity Y. So, as a result of decline in price of commodity X, whatever quantity demanded of commodity X increases, it has increased. On the face of it, it appears it has increased because of price effect. But this price effect consists of two kinds of the effects, as has been explained right now, and this increase in quantity demanded of X is because of two separate kinds of the effect, that is number one income effect and number two substitution effect. One as a result of increase in real income and the other as a result of decline in relative price of commodity X. This behavior of price and quantity demanded of commodity X can also operate in reverse direction. That is, if the price of X increases and price of its substitute good, say Y, remains constant, what will happen? The real income of the consumer would decline and the relative price of commodity X will become costlier, it will increase. So, these two effects combined together will produce price effect in such a manner that the quantity demanded of commodity X would decline when price of commodity increases. So, this is the behavior of price effect, income effect and the substitution effect. The demand for commodity X in this case has increased purely because of decline in relative price of commodity X, ceteris paribus, so far as this substitution effect is concerned. Thus, there are two explanations or theories, we can say, to explain the operation of the law of demand with Marshallian theory and the modern theory. The Marshallian theory explained the law of demand or reasons for decline in reasons for downward slope of the demand curve in terms of the law of diminishing marginal utility, and it stated that since marginal utility of each additional unit has a tendency to decline as per the law of diminishing marginal utility, the consumer would also be prepared to pay lower and lower price for the subsequent unit. It would not be ready to pay the same price for each subsequent unit that he desires to purchase, mainly because each subsequent unit of the commodity has a lesser quantity of utility for it, and a rational consumer would never commit such a mistake in which the prices are supposed to be high and marginal utility are supposed to be low. So, therefore, as per the Marshallian utility theory, a rational consumer will optimize his position, maximize his benefit or utility when Px is equal to marginal utility of x, Px is equal to Mux. The other theory explaining the law of demand or the downward slope of the demand curve is modern theory, which explained the operation of the law of demand or the downward slope of the demand curve in terms of price effect, income effect and substitution effect. We have right now seen that price effect is the change in quantity demanded of a commodity as a result of change in its own price, and this price effect is a combination of two separate types of effects, that is income effect and the substitution effect. Income effect brings about changes in quantity demanded of a commodity via changes in real income of the consumer, and the substitution effect brings about changes in quantity demanded of a commodity via changes in the relative price of the commodity to be consumed. So, these are the theory. There may be other factors for law of demand also besides these two important theories, and other factors also are responsible for bringing about change in quantity demanded of a commodity. The first important among other factors is change in number of consumers. An increase in price of the good increases the number of consumers and thus the total demand for the commodity and vice versa. I would make a correction here that any increase in the price of the good would reduce the quantity demanded of the commodity, and so the number of consumers would also decline, and it has an impact on the aggregate demands also, where the total demand for the commodity would decline. The diverse usage of the commodity also has an important role in explaining the law of demand. At lower price, the commodity may be put to several other uses, say for example steel, electricity, etc. When the prices of such commodities fall, the consumer has a tendency to increase the consumption of such commodity to some other less important uses, and if the price of such commodity increases, the consumer has a tendency to concentrate the consumption of such commodity only to the essential or very necessary goods uses. Now, we can turn to some exceptional cases where this law of demand does not operate, or where the demand curve does not slope to the right. In the previous section of the lecture or slides, we have already seen that what are the reasons for the operation of the law of demand, but those situations are only applicable in case of a normal condition also. There are certain conditions when the law of demand does not operate at all, and the demand curve, instead of sloping downward to the right, may slope upward to the right. Such cases are explained here. The first such case is the case of Giffen good. Giffen good is a kind of, say, inferior good, and for inferior good the law of demand does not operate. When the price of the Giffen good increases, its quantity demanded also increases, and when the price of Giffen good falls, its consumption also falls. Why does it happen? So, this concept was explained by a famous economist, say Robert Giffen, and I would like to explain the concept of Giffen good and why the law of demand does not operate in case of Giffen good with a simple example. Say for example, commodity Z is a Giffen commodity. It is a highly inferior kind of the commodity, and if the consumer is consuming a very small quantity of the Giffen good due to his limited resources or limited income at his disposal, and he is unable to consume very less amount of the superior or the normal commodity, what happens that when the price of the Giffen good increases, then the consumer is worse off, its economic position declines, or you can say his real income declines. So, in case of decline in the real income of the consumer, he is forced to consume larger quantity of such commodity, this inferior commodity, and he is forced to decrease the consumption of some normal commodity, because he cannot go without it. He cannot survive without consuming this. He is forced to consume this Giffen commodity. In other cases, say for example, the price of Giffen good declines. What will happen? The real income of the consumer has increased. So, now the consumer would be willing to reduce the consumption of Giffen good and increase the consumption of, he will reallocate his income in favor of some normal commodity or some inferior, superior commodity. So, therefore, in case of Giffen good, the price of the commodity and its quantity demanded are positively related. However, one thing should be kept in mind here, that this will happen only in case of the in case where the change in real income, be it negative or positive, is higher than the change in the relative price of the commodity, or in other words we can say that income effect is, negative income effect is greater than positive substitution effect, because the change in price of the Giffen good would also generate some substitution effect also via changes in the relative price of this commodity. So, in order to operate, in order to explain this Giffen goods, it is very essential to observe what is the quantum of the income effect, what is the quantum of the substitution effect. Even if income effect is negative for some inferior commodity, but its quantum is smaller than the positive substitution effect, then in that case the law of demand would operate, but its intensity would be lesser than that of a normal commodity, demand curve for a normal commodity. It is very essential to understand and observe very carefully the behavior of the income effect as well as the substitution effect, their direction as well as their quantum. Number two important exceptions to the law of demand is the items of luxurious consumption or items of conspicuous consumption. Normally what happens that the high price of the luxurious item or items related to prestige are normally high. The prestigious commodities or luxurious commodities command relatively higher price than the normal commodity. So, in order to feel dignified in the society, in order to feel in order to show off in the society, even if the price of such commodities increase, the people have a tendency to increase quantity demanded of that commodity. So, in case of such commodities, the higher the price, the higher will be the consumption or demand for these commodities, and here in this case the law of demand does not operate. If the price of a very comfortable, very luxurious commodity becomes very less, it declines, then its demand will also decline. Say for example, if the price of gold, the price of diamond, platinum becomes very low, it declines miserably, then its demand will also decline, provided that a perception is created in the mind of the consumers, the normal individuals, that once the prices has fallen too much for this precious metal, in future their prices are not going to increase. Only in that case, the lower the price of such commodities, the lower will be the consumption of these commodities. Because if the price is very low for this precious metal, using these metals, wearing these the ornaments made up of this precious metal would command no prestige, no dignity at all in the society. Therefore, these commodities are such that there exists a positive or direct relationship between the price of these commodities and quantity demanded of these commodities. Third important exception is the case of emergency. In case of emergency, when there is emergent situation, the normal law of demand breaks down, and in this emergency case, even if the prices are high, people will have a tendency to increase quantity demanded of their a particular commodity, and vice versa. Then we have change in taste, fashion and preferences. We all know that in modern days particularly, the people, if people or a section of the people in the society develop some kind of taste or preference for a commodity, or the fashion changes in favor of some commodity, even if prices are shooting up, the demand will not fall. Either it will remain the same, or it will increase gradually, or it will shoot up very sharply. So here also the law of demand would not change. And if some commodity becomes out of fashion, people develop some kind of distaste for a commodity, or they show their lower preferences for a commodity, even if the prices are declining, very less quantity of demand would forthcome. Then next important factor, the exception to this law of demand is ignorance. If people are ignorant about the prevailing market prices at different places, even then this law of demand would hardly operate, and we will find that the law of demand does not the law of demand does not operate, or the demand curve is not necessarily sloping downward to the right. Another important concept related to the demand analysis is the shape of the demand curve and their shift in the demand curve, then change in the demand curve. We can see two kinds of behavior in the demand curve. One is the movement of price and quantity demanded along a given demand curve. So this is a normal demand curve, and this shows the relationship between price of a commodity and its quantity demanded. And if the price falls, quantity demanded increases, and if price increases, quantity demanded falls. This movement of price and quantity demanded happens along a single demand curve, sloping downward to the right. And the factor behind movement along the demand curve is none other than the price of the commodity itself. Another important dynamics associated with the demand curve is shift of the demand curve. This is also known as change in demand. The earlier one was known as change in quantity demanded, this is known as change in demand. So, if the price of commodity does not change and quantity demanded increases, price remaining same, and if quantity demanded increases, what are the factors responsible for this? The factors responsible for this may be change in the level of income of the consumer, change in prices of the related goods, or change in taste, fashion and preferences, etc. Remember, in the earlier part of our lecture, I had explained you that general demand function where dx was a function of px, pr, y, taste, fashion and preferences, etc. So, shift of the demand curve upward or lower, downward, may be because of other factors than the price of its own. In this example, in this diagram, we see that at OP price, when the demand curve is DD, the quantity demanded is OQ1. Now, price remaining same at OP2, if price remaining same, if other factors are active, they became operational, like income of the consumer, prices of the related goods and other factors, then the quantity demanded has increased from OQ1 to OQ2 and the demand curve has shifted from DD to DD1. Point A is the indication of this dynamics, that price remaining same, the quantity demanded has increases and there is upward shift of the demand curve. In this case, this is known as shift of the demand curve. The other case may be that the similar kind of the variables will be operational, but in reverse direction, wherein the price remaining same, the quantity demanded has declined mainly because of the other factors, prices remaining same, and in this case the demand curve has shifted downwards from DD to DD0. Now, in brief, what could be the reasons for the shift in the demand curve? Number one is increase in the number of consumers, increase in the income and wealth of the consumers, favorable changes in consumers' taste, expectation of higher price in future, increase in price of substitutes, decrease in price of complementary goods, and change in the income of the consumers. So, friends, we have seen in a little bit detail the demand analysis consisting of the law of demand, the reasons for the operation of the law of demand. Then we have also seen the why, in other words, why does the demand curve slope downward to the right, and how it can be explained in terms of both the traditional theory, that is Marshallian theory of utility, and in terms of the modern theory, in terms of the price effect, income effect and the substitution effect, how the price effect consisting of income and substitution effect can operate both in forward direction and the backward direction, and how can we distinguish between a normal commodity, an inferior commodity and a given commodity with the help of the income effect and the substitution effect. We have also seen the movement along the demand curve. We have also seen the shift in the demand curve, that is change in quantity demanded and change in demand in both direction, increase in demand as well as decrease in demand. Then we have also seen the some important exceptions to the law of demand, and these are the cases where the law of demand does not operate. And in the next part of our lecture, we will be dealing with the law of supply, and because it's very essential to understand the price mechanism, which would take resort to both the law of demand and law of supply Thank you very much. We will meet in the next part of our lecture. Thank you
Dear
very
friends, due to paucity of time, we have to stop a lecture here. We hope that today's lecture were able to understand different aspects of demand. And on that note, we would like to thank Dr. Bharat Singh for coming here and delivering this wonderful lecture. And thank you, dear friends, for watching our lecture. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.